So here we are in the 21st century, and we have water problems. We know that all human activities and life itself depend on water. We also know that population growth, urbanization, climate change affect water and threaten its sustainability. Now tonight what I want to do is explore three questions that are really at the core of this issue of sustainability. Can we manage water sensibly with regard for the welfare of future generations and other species? Must the cost of potable water, and by potable I mean water that can actually be consumed by humans and other forms of life, become prohibitively expensive for the poor? Many of you have been reading and studying about the privatization of water supply. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, some of the things that we've learned over time about the threats, real and imagined, by privatization. And then I want to talk most of all about who will control decisions regarding these issues. Today, tomorrow, your children, your grandchildren. So let me start out with a thesis. And the thesis is a pretty broad one. It's that historically the predominant approach to managing water across the world embraces something that we in political science call hard power. And it's a phenomenon that began with the concept of hydraulic societies. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. Hydraulic societies of antiquity, ancient civilizations, in fact, really arose precisely to control, harness, manage water. Hard power relies on centrally organized markets, laws, and institutions, administrative systems to allocate rights and access to a few interests. Water resources historically have been developed through large public works projects that favor economic growth, and they tend to disfavor social equity and the environment. We'll see some examples of this even here in California. Some of you are familiar with the Owens Valley, where Los Angeles derives a good percentage of its water. And a third characteristic is that the more powerful protagonists in water policy who manage river basins and groundwater not only control the use and the diversion or the movement of water, but historically they control information regarding water. And information is a form of power. Now over the past 15 to 20 years, there is an approach that has grown up, which we call soft power. It's an alternative to this hard power approach, and it relies, as we're going to see later this evening, on consensus building and broad participation. So let's first look fairly quickly at some of the major challenges to 21st century water management to kind of set the stage. And let me start with supply. Some of you have had my water resources course, have seen this figure or something similar. Basic gist of this figure is to show you that even though the world is some 70% covered by water, most of it is saline, and it cannot be consumed unless you desalinate it. Glaciers and ice caps, and lakes, rivers, and groundwaters really comprise only 3% of the entire planet's water supply. And if you were to break these figures down even more minutely, you would find that not only is some 97% locked up in salt water in the oceans, but fully 2% in ice caps and glaciers, which are disappearing, as many of you know. 61/100ths% is in groundwater. Surprisingly, there is actually more fresh water locked up underground, and only this much, 9/1000ths, is actually in the form of surface water. And an almost equal proportion is in soil moisture. So there's not a lot of fresh water to go around. And as many of you know who have been studying sustainability in this course and others, when you have a vital, irreplaceable resource that is scarce, people are going to compete and contend over its control. Let's switch for a moment to the uses of water. This figure from the Climate Institute is a global breakdown of water use, and as you can see, fully 2/3 of the world's water goes for agriculture. Surprisingly, only about 9% is used by individual households. So we have a scarce resource that's used to produce food and fiber, and what's left supports everything else. If we look at the trends in water use, particularly over the past century, we find three things. In the 20th century, global water demands rose at a much faster rate than the rate of population. So you can't really say that, well, sure, we use more water because we have more people. No. It's grown at a rate that's twice that of population growth. The reason is because the production of food and fiber account for 70% of global water use. And ironically, as countries develop and our diets improve and our caloric intake increases, we're also placing greater demands on the water cycle. And in some regions of the world, growing scarcity and adverse quality are threatening the integrity of that food supply, human health, and ecosystems. And you'll note in these parentheses, I've noted some organizations you can go to for further information on these. The World Meteorological Organization for demands, the World Resources Institute, which has studied the use of water for food and fiber, and the United Nations Environment Program and UNESCO, which, as we'll see in a few moments, have concentrated very much on this issue of scarcity and quality. This is a figure from a political scientist, Peter Glick, who works in Oakland, California, for an institute called the Freshwater Resources Institute. And basically, this is a map of the world by safe drinking water access. Simplest way to interpret this is if you're a country that has any shade of red, you have a high percentage of people that are not served by public supply systems that can ensure healthy, potable water. And the darker the shades of red, as you see in parts of Latin America, East Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, the more dire that problem is because an even greater percentage of the population lacks safe access. Some analysis before we go on to control and power about water and public health. I don't want to spend a lot of time with these figures, but I do want to impress upon you that if I were to simplify this slide and simply make one overview comment, it would be bad water equals all of the major public health problems on the globe today. And I don't think that would be an exaggeration. Millions of people suffer and millions die because of impure, non-potable water supplies. The same water that must be used to produce our food and fiber, feed our growing cities, is also in many underdeveloped countries very dangerous to consume. Now, population and water, and I'm going to concentrate for a couple minutes on one aspect of population growth that my research and the research of others suggest is the real problem in terms of water supply and people, and that is urbanization. Throughout the world, we have a growing phenomenon of what we call megacities, cities that have populations in the tens of millions of people. Many, as you can see from this table, which is based on data from the World Resources Institute and the European Environment Agency, are in less developed countries. Now, without going through a lot of the statistical meanings behind this, let me simply say that in any society, and this is true in most of Western Europe, it's true in North America, it's true in Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, on average, there is sufficient fresh water that is potable that exceeds 1,700 cubic meters per person a year, and that is considered a good standard of water. That's water for everything. The water we consume, the water we bathe with, the water that produces our food, the water that powers our industries, and so forth. Water stress is defined as situations where you have between 1,000 and 1,700 cubic meters per person per year. And water scarcity is cities and countries where you have less than 1,000 cubic meters per person per year. Now, embedded in this table is some very interesting information. And I think I'll make simply two observations. As more and more cities in the developing world become mega cities, we're going to see more cities falling into one or the other of these categories. And so a lot of cities that are already undergoing stress in the developing world are only going to confront greater stress as they become larger. The second observation I would make is that these are precisely countries in which disputes over water either have become or are becoming as we speak major political contests between various interest groups. And water stress is close to home. Many of you know that Los Angeles imports virtually all of its water. Some from the Owens Valley, some from the State Water Project. Half the water in Los Angeles comes, in other words, from the Sierra. Some 40% from the Colorado River, and less than 10% actually is locally available, either through groundwater, which is mostly percolated water that come from these distant projects, or recycled water. So it's a problem everywhere, and there are pressures to decrease imports of water, which underscore the fact that Los Angeles, like many major cities, is threatened by the fact that its local supplies are controlled externally. This is a figure from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what I want to say about this figure is a couple of things. Complicated figure, lots of information. You'll be able to look and study these figures later on. But as you know, the scientists who work for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change know that as the climate changes, water will be one of the resources that's gravely, seriously threatened. What we don't know, however, is how warm the overall temperature will be and what havoc it will play with the climate and other resources. So what this figure depicts is a range of possibilities, from 0 degrees Celsius to 5 degrees Celsius changes from the baseline of the 1980 to 1999 period, which is where the latest IPCC data uses as a baseline. And basically what you can see is you're going to have three big problems affecting water. You'll have increased water in the moist tropics and higher latitudes, less water in the mid-latitudes and semi-arid regions, which means us and much of the developing world, and hundreds of millions of people exposed to increased, look at the phrase, water stress, exactly what we talked about in terms of cities momentarily. So the warmer it gets, the worse this havoc will arise, and while there's tremendous uncertainty, the basic direction of change is going to occur, and it's going to be pretty grave. Climate change in the Southwest. There's an organization called the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, which a couple of years ago did a study showing that reduced flows in many of the world's major rivers are already threatening future supplies of food and water. Notice the Colorado River in the southwestern United States, which is a major supplier of water for Southern California, falls under this envelope. This is a slide that depicts both a graphic of the various ways climate change will affect water here in California. And as you can see, virtually every environmental parameter you can imagine, from snowpack in the high Sierras, which actually constitute our water supply here in Southern California, to the generation of power, to agriculture, to habitat, to the integrity of the flood control levee system in the Central Valley and around Sacramento. Any of you here in Sacramento? Sacramento is more vulnerable than any metropolitan area of the United States to a catastrophic failure of a levee system, with one exception, New Orleans. It's a surprise to most people, but it's true. This is a picture at the bottom of Lake Mead, Hoover Dam. Many of you have been to Las Vegas. If you get tired of gambling or whatever, you go over to the lake, you can have fun boating, but that lake is about 30 feet below its capacity. And right now it holds, as of at least last summer, about 60% of what it was designed to hold. Why? Less precipitation, less snowmelt in the Rockies. Scientists believe this is an early warning sign, a canary in the coal mine, if you will, of global climate change. So, now that we have an overview of the issues, let's look at how we manage water through hard power. I mentioned the phrase hydraulic societies earlier. Many of you who have traveled overseas have had the opportunity to see the beautiful remains of Roman aqueducts, many of which were built some 2,000 years or more ago, as this one in southern Spain. In China, another ancient civilization during the Qin dynasty, a massive irrigation project is depicted here, was built in the Min River in Sichuan province. And a painting below that depicts Nile River irrigation, painted, we believe, around 2,000 years BC. Significance. These beautiful archaeological and artistic works were built in authoritarian societies that used slave labor and serfdom to marshal thousands of people to construct waterworks to build imperial power. That hydraulic tradition of hard power is something that has carried through many civilizations, including our own. I mentioned the Owens Valley earlier. Hard power and hard feelings. Some of your grandparents and great-grandparents may have told you stories about this. In the 1920s, people in the Owens Valley north of Los Angeles became so angry over the diversion of their valley's water supply to satisfy the growing needs of Los Angeles that there were not one but several attempts to dynamite the aqueduct. The people who did it were called terrorists, and the city of Los Angeles hired detectives to root them out and kill them before they would continue to destroy. And you see this article, an old article from the forerunner of the Los Angeles Times describing this problem. Some historical views to put this in perspective. Karl Wittfogel was a renowned historian who wrote about Oriental despotism. And basically, as this quote shows, he believed that a tradition of hard power to control water was something that began with ancient societies who directed their minions to develop and harness water in the ways that we saw pictorially just a few moments ago. Here in the western United States, according to Donald Worster, a political scientist who has studied water issues, same thing. A social order based on the intensive, large-scale manipulation of water and its products in an arid setting. A coercive, monolithic, and hierarchical system ruled by a power elite. It's a pretty strong indictment of the way we manage water in the American West and in California, but it has more than a grain of truth to it. And now today, this was an article from last summer's New York Times. It concerns a pending water dispute that is now between India and Pakistan and the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Essentially, India wants to build a dam in Kashmir, which, as you know, is a disputed territory claimed both by India and Pakistan. The water and the power generated by this project will go to India. Pakistan has fears, as you can see, that India will manipulate the water flowing to its agricultural industry, a quarter of its economy and an employer of half its population. So, again, hard power contests very much alive in the world today. I want to look at some cases around the world that exemplify this hard power phenomenon, some of which have ironically been in the news in ways that I didn't even contemplate when I began putting this presentation together. If you didn't know that this was pronounced Sana'a, you probably do now, because Yemen and Sana'a have been very much in the news, a place where there is considerable political unrest. The map shows you where Sana'a is, which is the capital of Yemen. A city of some 2 million people whose experts believe will exhaust its water in 20 years. This picture, by the way, are trucks that are hired by the local government of Sana'a to take water from distant groundwater supplies, truck it into the city, and provide it at a cost to households. This is how you get your water in Sana'a, Yemen. More water is withdrawn from the country's aquifers than is being replaced or replenished. It doesn't rain very much in Yemen. And to make matters worse, the Reuters news service, which first began reporting on this problem last year, notes that much of the shortage can be blamed on an agricultural product of sorts, a national drug habit called khat, which provides a cash crop industry for impoverished people throughout Yemen. So you have underdevelopment and poverty leading to a cash crop to keep an economy going, which is worsening the problem of water supply, which is contributing to the lack of sustainability. And you have, as I show at the bottom of the slide, a country that in the context of a civil war, a separatist movement led by Al-Qaeda, a high rate of poverty, climate change, and an authoritarian political system that favors elite hard power, little capacity to sustain water supply. It's a rhetorical question. I guess the answer is they don't manage it very well. And you can understand a lot of the tension going on in that part of the world. I mentioned privatization before, and I want to address an example of privatization and hard power control. This centers around the city of Cochabamba, Bolivia. In 1999, the World Bank demanded that Bolivia, in order to reduce its debt that it had incurred to the World Bank, that it had to privatize many of its public utilities, including its water supply systems. So the Bolivian Congress passed a drinking water and sanitation law that ended government subsidies to municipal utilities. And soon afterwards, a series of private corporations, this one which took on the very innocuous name International Water, was actually a consortium of French companies, including Vivendi, and Bechtel Corporation in the United States, who went in and said, we'll provide water, we'll build a distribution system, as long as we can make a profit. The government said, go right ahead, and you can see the results. Water bills reached $20 a month in a city in which the local minimum wage is less than $100 a month. The utility was given power over all of the potable water in Cochabamba. People used to collect rainwater on their roofs and store it in cisterns. Under the agreement, that water belonged to International Water. You couldn't use your own water from the clouds. The increases forced poor families to choose between food and water. There were demonstrations and violent riots that occurred. El agua es del pueblo. Water is the country or land. The government changed course. amended the Constitution to guarantee a right to water, banned privatization of supply, and so Bolivia now no longer has privatization. But the bad news is the government does not have the resources to upgrade water supplies or protect quality. So the people once again control water, but the government is not really providing sufficient resources to make sure it's safe. The Nile Basin in Africa, many countries, 10 to be exact, and some 160 million people depend on this, one of the world's largest rivers, for their water supply. Since 1998, these countries have been negotiating a framework agreement to allocate water. And when you have several countries sharing a water source, typically you're going to have conflict, particularly if those countries vary in power and vary in their needs. Now, ironically, I say ironically, Egypt and the Sudan, which are downstream countries, and downstream here means the top of the slide, okay? The Nile flows into the Mediterranean. These downstream countries, which also have the largest populations, refuse to relinquish power to the upstream countries over withdrawal. I say ironic because traditionally in water disputes, whoever controls the headwaters, where the rivers originate, can shut off the supply. By definition, they control the flow. But in 1929, when many of these countries were British colonies, the British decided that they would allocate greater rights to favor Egypt and Sudan. And that agreement has remained a fixed in-place treaty which has foiled efforts to renegotiate and reopen discussions to more equitably share the water. And on top of that, Lake Victoria, at the very bottom of the slide, which is a major source of the Nile's water, is falling in its elevation by some 2.5 meters every 3 years. Climate change has definitely been implicated as the major cause. So you're going to have less water, more people. The basin's population against the base year of 2000 will double by 2035. And you have 10 countries that cannot agree on how to allocate because the downstream countries that are already getting a lot of water don't intend to open it up and share it with the upstream countries unless somehow that changes. Finally, under hard power, I want to talk about the use of dams and diversion projects to control water. I mentioned that this was a principal means of exercising hard power. Itaipu is a dam that was built some years ago in the 1980s. It was completed in Brazil. It is no longer the world's largest hydroelectric power facility. It was until 2 years ago when Three Gorges Dam in China went online. Itaipu is now the second largest. I don't know if you get a silver medal for winning that race or coming in second. This is a major water project that has harnessed the Paraná River that straddles the boundary between Brazil and Paraguay. It's a project that was pursued by these countries jointly to promote economic growth and political visibility. For Brazil especially, this project says, we have arrived. We are a major player. This facility provides 20% of Brazil's electricity and some 94% of Paraguay's. The project fostered centralized planning and economic cooperation. A binational commission run by the governments of both countries built, manage, and operate the project. They relocated native tribes, and we're going to come back to that issue momentarily. And they market the power from the project. The project did exactly what it was intended to do. It encouraged foreign investment from Argentina, Italy, and the United States, mostly use that surplus electricity to smelt aluminum. Cheap power, cheap aluminum, that's a good way to propel your economies forward. It's an engine of regional economic development, as said by this binational commission. Brazil's economy is now the largest by far in Latin America. Paraguay's is one of the fastest growing, though not obviously with as evenly distributed benefits nationally. Now that's good news, perhaps. But what about the downside? Well, some 700 square kilometers of old-growth forests were destroyed in the creation of this massive impoundment. And some 10,000 people were forcibly relocated from their homes and villages which were flooded. Some species of plants, including a rare orchid found nowhere else in the world, became extinct. To compensate, there were biological reserves and a monitoring program that was established by Brazil and Paraguay to avert further damage. But at least according to the Nature Conservancy, which did a study of this project some 15 years after it was completed, the study was just done by the Nature Conservancy last year, while further environmental damage may have been averted, the initial impacts are likely irreversible. So this is a project that has a huge environmental footprint. And now there's conflict between the precise countries that work together to build this thing. Paraguay, which already gets 94% of its power from this dam and is still a very undeveloped country, doesn't need any more power, so it wants to sell its share to someone else, maybe Argentina, or whomever will buy it. Brazil says, no, we helped build it, we're the more powerful partner. If you're going to sell it, the revenues are going to be divided between you and us. So conflict and inequalities are already emerging. And then there's Three Gorges, which is the largest water project in the world. The Three Gorges Dam impounds a reservoir that is about the size of Lake Superior, which is the largest lake in the Great Lakes. A massive public works project when it was constructed, tens of thousands of workers over some 15 years to clear the land, to clear trees, to relocate people, to relocate cities, as we'll talk about momentarily, and to construct this large public work project, which is nearly 2 miles in length from shore to shore. And this is a nice view of Three Gorges because what you can see on the far left is a power plant, the world's largest hydroelectric plant. In the middle, flood control, some water is being let through the spillways. And on the far right, you can only see a little tip of this, is a navigation lock. This dam also controls navigation on the Yangtze. And so this is really a major, major economic project. According to the Chinese government, the purpose of Three Gorges was to create a better environment. Now you might be wondering, how can you build a dam to create a better environment? Well, it created the world's largest hydroelectric facility, a facility that generates as much power as some 10 to 15 coal or nuclear power plants. And the Chinese have long argued, would you rather we burn more coal to get this power? Or perhaps you'd like us to generate more radioactive waste. It's kind of a Faustian bargain, isn't it? It was an innovative central planning scheme. The government cooperated with the Chinese Academy of Sciences in constructing, operating, and monitoring, and presumably signing off on the impacts. The goal was to build up a power project to promote economic development and improve the local eco-environment and benefit reservoir migrants, those who had to be relocated. Flood control of the Yangtze River has been ensured. Some 15 million people are protected from a 1 in 100th chance probability flood in any given year. That's what we mean by a 100-year flood. Year-round navigation. between Shanghai and or all the way to Shanghai and the East China Sea from Three Gorges is assured. And even before the dam was complete 3 years ago, navigation tonnage increased by some 6-fold. So this is a huge economic boon. And the Chinese government gained experience to build other water projects, not just in China, but to import their knowledge to build dams in other countries. And the Chinese want to do that. Well, how many people exactly were displaced? We don't know. We think somewhere between 1.3 and 2 million people were involuntarily displaced. Many cities, towns, and villages were inundated. Many archaeological sites were lost and are unrecoverable because 600 kilometers of the valley was flooded. And China was in such a hurry to build this project that hundreds of factories and mines and waste dumps were simply abandoned without even being dismantled or shut down or capped, leading to effluents and silts and pollutants and even rubbish filling the reservoir. On top of that, after the project was built, there was erosion, both along the upstream and downstream habitats of the reservoir, causing landslides and threatening river dolphin and paddlefish habitat. These are endangered species that China values greatly. The Chinese Academy of Sciences think that annual fishery catches in the East China Sea may be reduced by some 1 million tons due to freshwater declines in sediment. This was a project to improve the environment and improve the economy, and it's having opposite impacts. And the project has been plagued by accusations of corruption, spiraling costs, protests against resettlements that did not accompany actual resources being invested in new housing and new jobs. In short, broad public participation was not embraced. And of course, this is not a novelty in China. It is a characteristic of hard power in water development worldwide. So what's an alternative? Let me first define what I mean by soft power, this emerging approach that we've seen over the past 15 years or so. Soft power consists of the growth of initially national and then eventually global networks of non-governmental organizations, principally environmental groups, scientists, and regional intergovernmental bodies, local governments, regional governments, working together to manage water problems. Instead of a top-down approach, it's a bottom-up approach. It's an approach that seeks to advance a reform agenda through compelling parties to adopt what we in political science call normative power, shared values and attitudes that can potentially transcend division by bringing together local input in decision-making and depoliticizing essential management functions. And I'm going to come back to this concept of depoliticizing water. How do you depoliticize water? How do you turn it into something that can be routine, where people can collaborate even if they disagree on other issues? Now, we call it soft power. Notice I don't call it wimpy power. I'm going to come back to that in the conclusions. It's authority that emanates from cooperation and non-hierarchically negotiated agreement. Partnerships between governments and NGOs, including transnational cooperation. As we're going to see in the examples that follow, and as I'm going to say in my conclusions, it may be soft because it's decentralized, but it is still authoritative, and it can work. It does work. I want to look at some examples, and I want to start with this one. Again, from Latin America. About 8 years ago, 9 years ago now, The UN Partnerships for Sustainable Development and Agenda 21 launched a collaboration called the Latin American Clean Water Initiative. The idea was to partner with several countries in the region, as well as non-governmental organizations, to actually build capacity to provide water supply and maintain it. Partners install potable water and sanitation systems. That part's fairly easy and straightforward. But the more difficult challenge is building social capacity by constructing these systems, by improving irrigation and degraded water systems that already exist, and finally, and I think most importantly, these last two bullets, involving beneficiary families in local communities in the construction and or the repairs of water systems. We've all heard the aphorism, teach a person to fish versus, or give a person a fish versus teach a person to fish. This is it, okay? Teach a person to maintain and build their own water supply. And training communities to manage and administer potable water and sanitation systems to ensure long-term sustainability. It responds to a tractable need. 40 million people in this region lack potable water. Some 134 million lack adequate sanitation systems. And you'll recall from our earlier discussion right at the outset when I set the stage of talking about some of the global challenges of water, contaminated water has a devastating effect on vulnerable communities where water-related illnesses are a leading cause of death. This is a response practically to a tractable problem. Honduras is one example where this partnership is doing some really great things. 800 low-income communities are being provided with potable water and latrine. Community water boards have been created to train residents on the installation, maintenance, and the administration of these systems. So long after the partners leave, long after the aid stops, people will be trained to maintain and operate and train others to maintain and operate these systems. The evidence is encouraging. Let me turn to a less encouraging situation, but one I think is very powerfully persuasive when we look at soft power. On the left is the Jordan River Valley. The King of Jordan some years ago once quipped that this is a river that has much more history than it does water. It's true. Jordan doesn't have much water, but it certainly has a lot of history. On the right is a map of Israel and the West Bank region showing major aquifers, underground water reservoirs, which are the principal source of water in Israel and in Palestine. Now you'll notice all these arrows. Basically what that is saying is that these aquifers underlie a mountain aquifer range which passes roughly through the middle. And as we all know, water flows downhill. Of course, I could add water also flows toward money, but that's for later. Water flows downhill, which means much of the water from this aquifer system naturally flows toward Israel. Now hold that thought. Israel and Palestine, as if there aren't enough issues dividing these nations, let's add contested water. Prior to 1948, water disputes were very common in Palestine. Jewish settlers seized local waterworks from Arab communities. That was one of the things they did to establish their villages and their settlements. Arab communities in turn did the same thing in retaliation. 3 major wars in 1948, 67, and 75. Water supplies were explicitly threatened during those wars by both sides. Headwaters of the Jordan River and of other streams and storage works were viewed as strategic targets. In 1973, the Israelis seriously contemplated attacking the Aswan High Dam on the Nile River in Egypt. Not to destroy the dam, but to destroy the power plant. After the 1967 war, Israel acquired control of the West Bank and the Sea of Galilee. Some 80% of the region's groundwater flow. And since 1973, the last major regional war, settlement issues, which are ongoing, have often revolved around the control of local supplies. Water works, both water treatment and water supply, have been frequent military targets of protagonists on both sides. Now, in January of 2001, as a result of something called the Oslo Accord, which was an effort to try to depoliticize some of the conflicts between Israel and Palestine, local authorities, not the national authorities, but local government officials in Palestine villages and Jewish settlements formed something called a Joint Water Committee. And they drafted a charter which ambitiously declared that water and the wastewater sphere must be removed from the circle of violence in the region. What they proposed to do was to share water in a divided context. Now, how do you do that when you have four challenges? The groundwater aquifers that straddle the West Bank and Israel, the watersheds and the political boundaries, as we saw, don't match up very well. The groundwater, as I also stated earlier, generally flows toward Israel, and Israel uses about 5 times the amount of water per person as do Palestinians, much of it for agriculture. When violence has erupted in the region, the seizure of water supplies and aqueducts and pumping facilities, as I noted, has historically occurred. But here's the biggest challenge. After decades of this struggle, both polities now recognize that they cannot claim a natural monopoly over water. Both have to find some way of sharing this scarce resource. Over and above all the other difficulties and differences, they got to share the water. The Joint Water Committee is comprised of local officials charged with managing water infrastructure. Under their agreement, they are sworn to take all necessary steps to provide water, treat sewage in the West Bank and Gaza, repair water lines, maintain supplies, provide drinking water to all communities. If there's a failure in a Palestinian community, Israeli workers come out and help fix it. If there's a failure in a Jewish community, Palestinian officials come out, fix it, and repair it. Both sides further agree not to harm or disrupt the work of personnel engaged in the repair, maintenance, or operation of waterworks. Now, criticisms over Israelis' overuse of water and pollution and poor management of drought conditions continues. Nevertheless, this is soft power cooperation. A precarious basis for cooperation, I would grant. It works because the water systems of the two peoples are, in the words of the Joint Water Committee, intertwined and inseparable. Kind of like Siamese twins, I suppose. Harm to any part of the system hurts everyone. The agreement is the culmination of a process that began in the 90s with an Israeli promise to increase water supply to the Palestinians by some 25%. Israel has made good on that. However, some would argue, with merit, that that's still not a lot of water. The agreement indirectly provides a means for ensuring compliance and verification. And maybe that's another reason it works. Each side knows at a local level how much water is consumed and by whom. And they both agree that wastewater treatment is a transboundary good. Untreated sewage in any community in this mixed society would be a health problem that does not respect political boundaries. Untreated sewage could cause cholera, which if it erupted in one community would immediately affect adjacent communities. Having said that, be aware, there are things this agreement does not do. The negotiators bracketed out larger territorial issues which they saw as unresolvable, and those problems remain intractable. Let me return to privatization and soft power. We talked about the example of Cochabamba, Bolivia. Worldwide, there is a growing movement to privatize water systems, especially in large megacities. It's seen as reducing costs and increasing the reliability. Privatization is criticized, however, for ignoring demands for equity and fairness and access. And there's been a growing body of literature that has criticized privatization for these reasons. Among other charges, water should be a basic right, but it's treated as a commodity. Decision-making in a private system is secretive, and the operations are vertically integrated, like a trust. Water is more expensive when it's privatized. Conservation of water is discouraged. Consumption is encouraged. The whole way you make a profit is to get people to use more water and thus pay more. And of course, privatization, as also claimed, exploits the poor. In developing countries, people pay a much higher percentage of their monthly income for water and sewer when they use small-scale private providers than do households connected to publicly owned systems in developed countries. So, pretty telling evidence. But it doesn't tell us all the evidence. In Europe, particularly in France and in the United Kingdom, privatization of water utilities is the norm. Private vendors, however, collaborate with local governments and with citizen oversight boards in setting rates and in operations policies. State and local governments manage river basins. They own the supply sources and the regional distribution systems, and they regulate equity. What happened in Cochabamba could not happen in France. Local governments would not allow it. Private companies provide distribution locally. They treat wastewater, and they're responsible for sales and marketing. But ratepayers view this arrangement as equitable, we have found, because there are clear public and private roles. Communities control and oversee the infrastructure. That is not true in most developing countries. So that partnership does not exist. And while Europeans do pay more for water than Americans, generally, those higher rates are designed to promote and ensure reliable water supply systems. When they leak, they're quickly repaired, which is something we don't do very well in public utility systems. And those higher rates actually promote conservation. So the point to make here is that if you can couple privatization with a soft power arrangement that gives citizens and local governments authority, maybe it can be workable. What you have in many developing countries is a privatization system that is overlain on top of a hard power system where there are vast inequalities. It would be inequitable, I'm arguing, no matter who manages it. And it is inequitable. I want to use one more example of soft power, and this is in Nigeria, the Hadejia-Jamari Basin. This is in northern Nigeria, a major agricultural region, a region that periodically suffers from characteristic flooding, which actually rejuvenates the soil, makes it possible to grow more things during the drier seasons. This is a closer in view of the Hadejia-Jamari Basin, its tributary streams and impoundments. The basin relies heavily on subsistence farming and small-scale fisheries. In the 1970s, the Nigerian government built two major dams in the basin to provide irrigation and flood control. Like Three Gorges in China, like Itaipu in Brazil and Paraguay, they were centrally planned and there was virtually no local participation. People weren't asked if they wanted the dams. The government said, we're going to build dams. The projects, after they were built, suffered from a number of unanticipated what we call cascading impacts. And by cascading impacts, what I mean, as you can see in this sequence, is one problem led to another, led to another, led to another. Silt backed up behind these dams. Water had to be released earlier to dilute the silt, but those earlier releases led to greater floods, which encouraged the infestation of a grass called typha grass, which clogged the streams, harming agriculture, inflicting severe losses on local fisheries, and then the farmers compensated by digging their own channels around this typha grass, which only led to more erosion. What a mess. Not nice to fool with Mother Nature? Is that the way the saying used to go? So, in 2002, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, an NGO which has a great interest in improving the management of water across the world, and the United Kingdom's Foreign Aid Agency offered to partner with the government of Nigeria to, quote, build local water resources management capacity in the basin. And they called this project the Joint Wetlands Livelihood Project. The goals were to improve local water information use, to introduce pilot projects to demonstrate best management practices, and thereby restore people's livelihoods. The projects were all small scale, and they were coordinated among different levels of government, brokered not only by government ministries in Lagos, but by local farmers and elected local officials. Consultative forums were formed at the local level, comprised of farmers and women's groups as well as others that advise this joint wetlands livelihood and engage in community-level training, just like the Latin American Clean Water Initiative. Now you might be wondering, why women's groups? Well, if you know anything about water supply in developing countries, you know that public supplies in rural areas are literally fetched by women and by children. So women's groups had a vested interest in making sure that water would now be managed locally in a sustainable manner. Local laborers were mobilized to clear grass, to restore dry lands, to restore fisheries, and to build local capacity. And local stakeholders support these projects because they can directly participate in them. They can develop projects without any central government having to intrude or supervise it. Now, let me conclude by some observations on some challenges looming down the road for soft power. In recent years, water engineers around the world have been promoting a technique called integrated water management, which means looking at water demand and water supply as a kind of integrated resource. To better manage, I should say, the world's scarce water supplies, although scare works too, I suppose, right? By imposing variable rate structures, by retrofitting water appliances, by wastewater reuse, a technique we use here in Orange County, much of it for potable use, by desalination and other supply-side innovations. Now let me leave you with some thoughts. These innovations are all feasible. Technically, they can work. But are they fair? Are some groups disproportionately burdened by them? Is the process for adopting them democratic? And do some groups benefit perhaps more from the provision of water through these means than do others? These are questions that are beginning to be raised by local environmental groups which are linking themselves together in these multinational networks. And so we are seeing more exercise of soft power on these questions. So what is soft power and water? Well, let me tell you first what I don't think it is. It isn't setting aside of self-interest or of the advocacy of one's need or of a willingness to contest the resource. Those things are still done and they need to be done. It's not naively idealist. We're not assuming that groups and individuals and nations will all sit down in a room, hold hands, and agree to share water altruistically. It's not an informal handshake. Sure, take all the water you want, no problem. You do the same for me. It's consensual, but reciprocal. Each side negotiates to get something in return. It's power. It's binding. And it is not yet a replacement for hard power. Think back to the example of Israel and Palestine. Over time, it may become a favored approach, but we're not there yet. Soft power is authority based on consent. It recognizes that centralized control, as all of the examples we've gone through this evening show, fail because watersheds and aquifers flow from high to low elevations. And you know, the funny thing about watersheds, they don't respect political boundaries. It acknowledges that decisions over water management made in one location may adversely affect users in another, creating disputes that transcend jurisdictions. So you can't control the resource centrally, you have to work with your opponent. It admits that no jurisdiction exercises total control over water, that groups define problems differently, such as irrigation, power, and public supply. And it understands, finally, that authority over water is subject to perceived fairness and accountability. If any group feels excluded, they will resist. They will resist under hard power, so get used to it and be prepared to accept a soft power model as an alternative. By demonstrating the feasibility of innovative solutions, soft power increases the likelihood that the control of water will benefit many people, not just a few. Soft power networks are locally initiated and globally connected webs, as we noted. A word that some political scientists are using to describe this unusual phenomenon is glocalization. They're local and they're global at the same time. Glocalization is a model that's spreading to the climate area and to biodiversity. Some of you have studied about the International Consortium of Local Environmental Initiatives, which tries to diffuse these efforts globally. These networks constitute sources of legitimacy that afford a counterweight to national governments and international organizations. And I think, and others think, are a harbinger of a new way of thinking about water. I'll leave you with a couple of quotes. This one from the Old Testament. I don't know if the ancient Hebrews knew of the concept of sustainability, but I have the feeling that whomever composed this verse had a pretty good idea of what it meant. But of course, some are less optimistic, including our old friend Mark Twain. Thank you.